to consume locally produced food rather than overseas food, or food in season rather than enjoying strawberries year-round, whatever, or lower meat and dairy production, or the ethical and fair trade issues, all the ones about ensuring that farming systems support good biodiversity and wildlife, and then all the water quality issues and aging populations. In many parts of the world, populations are getting older, often they're wealthier, and therefore spend lots more money, very particularly on what they have in the way of food. And then one of the biggest of all is food waste. An astonishing amount of food is wasted post the supermarket, i.e. people take it home and don't consume it and throw it away. And you're not just, it's a crime to have wasted that food, but also totally crazy to have used all those resources, released all those greenhouse gases to produce food not consumed. So trying to get a better use of food all the way up the chain is a really important issue too. So Lincoln has done lots of analysis around all of these, many of these issues to demonstrate that New Zealand farming systems are very effective. And so the basic issue around dairy was, if you look at all of the greenhouse gas effect, not just the energy, but animal emissions and nitrous oxide issues and all the rest from fertilizer, our farmers are significantly less in terms of the volume of greenhouse gases, or the kilograms of greenhouse gases per kilogram of milk solids. And this is the sort of analysis, the numbers that Lincoln has come up with. So this is, in the UK, that total farming system, all of those greenhouse gases per kilogram of milk solid, about 14 kilograms, about 11.6 in New Zealand. That's good, but we then need to think, well, that's static. How do we move these issues on? Similarly, in land, a huge difference between that carbon footprint of lamb produced in the UK versus lamb produced in New Zealand. Again, it comes down very much to the efficiency of our farming systems and transport. Well, that's good, but how do we move these issues on? The most obvious way in the first step is to make sure that all farmers are farming at the top of their game. So this is Lincoln's work comparing the Lincoln University's dairy farm, which is actually quite an intensive dairy farm, versus averages across the New Zealand industry. Now this is carbon footprint by cow by hectare, but the really important number is kilograms of milk solids. Because in fact, as I say, the Lincoln system is somewhat more intense, very minimal use of supplemental feed, I would add, for the dairy farmers. It's just very good pastoral farming. And so the Lincoln numbers are higher per cow per hectare, but when you turn that into real productivity of kilograms of milk solid, it's a lot better. So we already know a lot, and therefore we need to find ways to get that knowledge out to more dairy farmers so we can lift their performance overall. And this isn't just an environmental issue, this is very much an economic one as well, in terms of farming profitability, as Lincoln could also demonstrate. The last point to be mindful of these comparisons with the UK is the long-term trends. Now, Caroline apologises that this international data is not bang up to date, but over a long period you can see fertiliser use rising in the UK from the 1980s, from 1960s, peaking in 1981, and then gradually falling back. And in New Zealand, a very flat line, but from the early 80s, that fertiliser use per hectare starting to rise. Now, that intensity of fertiliser use has moved around a bit, particularly during the times of high farm debt and relatively low dairy prices. But the fact of the matter is, our farms are becoming heavier users of fertiliser, and British farmers less users of fertiliser. So we just need to be careful that, where we take these trends. So that's useful, but why would we wanting to engage in this? You know, why us? After all, our entire dairy production in New Zealand is less than 1 year's extra growth in production around the rest of the world. That just to set our dairy industry in perspective. And of course, we are very concerned about food prices. This is a long-run chart from the Food and Agriculture Organization of global food prices, running from 1990, reasonably static, a big spike in 2007, and a spike again now. The UN is very focused on the need to increase global food production by perhaps as much as 50% over the next 20 years, and perhaps as much as 100% over the next 40 years. And it says that's very much a question of productivity, of improving farming systems, which means a lot more science in farming systems, a lot more investment in farming systems, but then also ensuring that the best farmers in the world keep farming and can distribute that food widely, so making sure that trade flows are good in that. This is the CO2 picture for the world, and marvellous chart. You can see already China is by far the largest emitter of greenhouse gases versus the US. But of course the population of the US is close to 5 times, 1/5 the size of China, just touching 300 million people rather than about 1.4 billion people. So on a per capita basis, of course, the US is still far larger. Down here in our part of the world, Australia looks. Australia is not large in volume terms, but Australia's greenhouse gas emissions are the highest per capita in the world for a reasonable sized economy. Some Middle East countries, little emirates, are higher, but they do things like have indoor snow skiing in 40-degree centigrade weather. So that's us down here. And so again, in global terms, a very small volume of emissions. But per capita, if we include our animals in there too, we rank about 4th or 5th. We are wise to focus on these issues because of all developed countries, i.e. OECD countries, we are the most dependent on our natural environment for how we earn our living. And it's not just farming or agriculture or forestry. If you start to think more widely about all sorts of ways that that natural environment enhances the value or is crucial to the creation of that value in the New Zealand economy, it's big. And therefore we need to be sure that we are doing the best thing we can by our natural environment. The second good reason for doing this is that we are a very small country in terms of people and reasonably sized in terms of land, but not a lot more land we could bring into agriculture. So we want to use those resources very well. We also, in addition to having few people, don't have a great deal of capital. And therefore we've always been very innovative and very fast to innovate, trying to find new models, new ways of doing things. We've done that in all sorts of ways, whether it's having the first independent central bank in the world, or in all sorts of other ways in business. We've also been one of the leaders in trying to liberalise trade, because this country is far too small for us to earn a big living just from selling stuff to ourselves. So we've always played a role in the likes of trade negotiations with the WTO or with all sorts of United Nations issues. We've long played a role on climate change issues in the United Nations, and in fact the current chairman of the Kyoto Protocol is Adrian Macy, a New Zealand diplomat. And in fact, I've just spent the last couple of days in Wellington at a climate change and business conference, and Adrian, I had a good catch up with Adrian because he was one of our speakers. In terms of our response, I'll start with the government. The government's been very involved in two particular aspects of big leadership in these issues globally. Building on an idea first raised by Helen Clark's government, John Key went to the Copenhagen climate negotiations in 2009 and suggested that agricultural countries around the world formed a research alliance on agricultural greenhouse gases. And lots of people thought that was a good idea because there is a very simple concept lying behind that. If you look at those agricultural greenhouse gases, the chemical components are building blocks which are good nutrients. So therefore, these are farming systems that rather than use those chemicals well, those for nutritional purposes, is leaking them out as greenhouse gases. So if we can find a way to improve those farming systems, so we start to close those nutrient cycles, then we're going to get a better agricultural production and a better environmental outcome. So that's the big thing people are focused on. The other thing, of course, is that whilst there are many large developed countries who are big farmers, like the US, or indeed Europe as a whole, or even small ones like us, lots of developing countries are big farmers. So therefore, if we can involve them in this process, so they start to learn new technology, new science, new farming ways, that will improve their production, but also involve them much more in the global community, and therefore, hopefully, in the likes of climate change negotiations and frameworks. The alliance now consists of 36 countries, plus some observers, and they add up to about 70% of those countries of all agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we think of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions as methane, for example, from our ruminant animals, but it's far wider than that. And so the work is being pursued in three main areas. The first one is livestock, and that's all livestock. It's not just ruminant animals, it's non-ruminants as well. And we are leading that work with the Dutch. The second area is arable farming, croplands, and that's led by the United States. And then the third area is rice farming, because paddy fields produce prodigious quantities of methane. So, as I say, we think the world's picking on us because of the methane of our ruminant animals, but in fact methane is a very big issue in agriculture generally. And we in New Zealand are the secretariat for all that work. This is really important to us because this is bedrock science. This is really one of the leading edges of agricultural science. And so it's dead right that we should be involved. It's also become, because of the large financial commitment the government has made to it, our largest international science collaboration. That used to be the Antarctic program, but is now these greenhouse gases. Business engagement has been very interesting to track. It was immensely negative. At our conference the last couple of days, Nick Smith, the Environment Minister, was saying on Monday that new survey work he produced at the conference was a massive swing from a large majority of businesses being negative on the emissions trading scheme to now being positive. And he said an issue that generated 1,000 letters a week a couple of years ago now produces one. And so we're starting to see various leaders in various sectors emerge. Fonterra is one, not just on dairy here, but playing a crucial role in dairy internationally. I'll come back to them later. Air New Zealand is a leader on biofuels around the world. Zespri is by far the most advanced in terms of carbon footprinting and water footprinting, its resources and driving these issues. We're obviously very good on renewable energy, and even very completely domestic businesses like New Zealand Post. New Zealand Post is brilliantly focused on